Shadow the Hedgehog was dead for 18 years, but now he's back and bigger than ever. Let's talk about why and about what Sega needs to do to ensure that something like this never happens again. Sega declared 2024 to be the year of Shadow, and they weren't kidding considering how prominent of a role Shadow had in Sonic the Hedgehog 3, or the fact that he starred as the main character in his half of Sonic Cross Shadow Generation. Shadow hasn't had this much spotlight since the 2000s, and between the years 2007 to 2023, Shadow had barely made any appearances in any mainline 3D Sonic game. What made Sega neglect Shadow for so long? And what about their attitude has changed about incorporating him into more projects? To answer this, we'll have to go back to the very beginning. This is when Sega forgot about Shadow the Hedgehog and how he refused to die. Shadow made his debut all the way back in 2001 in Sonic Adventure 2. Considering his name is Shadow, he was conceptualized as a projection of Sonic and made to contrast yet match him in terms of heroism and coolness. Shadow serves multiple functions as a character in SA2. He not only makes for the perfect rival to Sonic, but due to his backstory, he also serves as an outlet for Sonic Team to tackle themes and subject matter that they've never been able to prior. Everyone always talks about Maria being shot, but something I think that goes under discussed is Maria's disease, neuroimmune deficiency syndrome. Maria's disease doesn't exist in real life, but what she goes through is akin to someone dealing with AIDS. I think it was incredibly brave of Sonic Team to include a chronically ill child character, not only for the sake of representation, but because of its real life implications. The AIDS crisis was at its peak during the 90s and into the 2000s, and with that of course came a stigma against both it, the people suffering through it, and media containing nods to it. Considering how many people died of AIDS around the time SA2 released, this I think makes Shadow and Maria's story resonate on a much more human level than it would have been had Maria's sickness been some random unnamed disease. I think SA2 is by far the best depiction of Shadow. The one thing I think this game does better than any other is its depiction of Shadow as this lonely, preppy, emotionally torn character. Shadow's past haunts him, and he is mysterious, but not for the sake of it. Through the conversations he has with characters like Rouge and Amy, Shadow again learns how to confide in people like he thinks he used to do with Maria, and he isn't afraid to talk about the things that are troubling him or even take advice from others. Shadow can be pompous and goal-driven, yet at the same time be cheesy and playful when he's around the likes of Sonic or his teammates. This was the perfect introduction for what a rival to Sonic should be, and it's easy to see why he became so popular and why Sonic Team made the retroactive decision to revive him and put him into Sonic Heroes. After Sonic Adventure 2 and the eventual failure of the Dreamcast, Sega underwent immense internal restructuring and decided to become a third-party developer. This would mean that Sonic would show up on their previous competitors' consoles for the first time ever. Sonic Team knew that this SA2 sequel would be millions of kids' first impressions of the character, and that this game would set the stage for the success of the Sonic brand going forward. Sonic Heroes, like Sonic Unleashed thereafter, can be seen as something of a soft reboot. While Heroes does thankfully still exist in the already established continuity, Heroes does not continue the tone established in SA2, and this of course has a ripple effect on Shadow. After the events of SA2, Shadow is presumably dead until Rouge finds him locked up in a capsule while infiltrating Eggman's base. It's here when Shadow's released from stasis and E123 Omega begins to spray bullets. This scene is iconic, not just because it's the introduction of Team Dark, but because it introduces us Shadow's plight after SA2. Shadow doesn't remember anything from his past, but as you can see from this sequence, is still inclined to help those in need and still has heroic yet standoffish tendencies. I've always found it strange that Rouge doesn't straight up tell Shadow who he is and the events of SA2, but I'm willing to suspend my disbelief because that would involve Rouge talking about his traumatic upbringing, and that's just not the game Sonic Heroes is trying to be. But for that reason, Shadow doesn't have that much to do here. Despite not being able to delve into his backstory, Shadow's characterization is still impressively faithful to his in SA2. He still doesn't talk much and can be quite docile, mostly thinking to himself, yet he still knows how to read the room and can engage in playful banter with the likes of Sonic or Rouge. I'd say his most evocative scene in Heroes takes place after Sonic and friends defeat Neo Metal Sonic. Sonic, of course, takes no time in gloating in Metal Sonic's face, albeit playfully, and runs off to seek his next adventure. Everyone else pretty much follows suit. Shadow and Omega, though, are the only characters that stay, tending to Metal Sonic in his defeated state. It's a blink and you miss it type scene, but it speaks perfectly to both of these characters' internal dilemmas. They were both creations of an Eggman, so they of course see themselves in Metal Sonic and don't celebrate a victory over a being as conflicted as they are. Sonic Heroes, I think, did the best it could with Shadow the Hedgehog, considering the outside factors affecting its development and Heroes' place in the franchise. Heroes, I think, only furthered Shadow's popularity, as he was primarily featured in much of the game's promotional material and even began to become a major character in various Sonic spin-offs. But no one at this point knew how important he would become to the franchise only one title later. During the mid-2000s, the general gaming landscape looked nothing like it did even a decade prior. Sega had for years not had a stake in the console war. There was a new guy in town with Microsoft and their Xbox, and Sony was killing it as usual, making even industry giant Nintendo submit to them in terms of consoles and software sales. Even the gaming audience itself was rapidly changing. The children that grew up with a Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were now adults. Gamers no longer wanted to play colorful 3D platformers and much preferred hopping online and competing in first-person shooters. Sega used to be the cool kid in town. They at one point had over 50% of the console market share, and they were the ones creating trends instead of chasing them. How could Sega, in their newfound position as a third-party developer, capitalize on the shifting gaming landscape? It's almost too perfect of a fit. The sequel to Sonic Heroes wouldn't be Heroes 2, or even has Sonic as its main character. And with that, I introduce you to Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow the Hedgehog is an anomaly. It is, I think, a perfect storm of chasing trends, a testament to the malleability of the Sonic franchise, and one of the strangest examples of a video game being a backdoor pilot. Bearing in mind that this is a solo title, you'd assume that Shadow's story would have been given an exorbitant amount of attention in terms of quality, but this couldn't be further from the case. I feel Shadow 05 completely mischaracterizes Shadow, and is responsible for people's perception of him changing from him being this soft-spoken, introspective hero into being, to be frank, a gunslinging, foul-mouthed edgelord. It came quickly, but this is already the decline of Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow the Hedgehog opens up on a pan of Shadow standing on the outskirts of Westopolis. He's contemplating his past till a red storm arrives, unleashing a herd of black arms into the nearby city. This doesn't seem to concern Shadow, however, as he scoffs at the idea of helping the citizens of Westopolis.
Look how pathetic they are. I don't have time for these humans.
And only the first cutscene in, and I'm already having problems with how Shadow is depicted. In Sonic Heroes, Shadow had been found in stasis for an undisclosed amount of time. Yet the moment he's unlocked and Omega begins to shoot, the first thing he does is get Rouge, someone he doesn't even remember, to safety. Shadow has a natural inclination for heroism, and Shadow 05 has already misunderstood that. After Shadow is about to abandon thousands of innocent people, he's stopped by Black Doom, an evil alien conqueror. This has always been a jump the shark-esque moment for me. Sonic stories have always had fantastical elements. Even in the more grounded stories of Sonic Adventure 1 or 2, the story dealt with ancient deities or the moon being destroyed. I know this is a talking blue hedgehog franchise, but even I can only suspend my disbelief so much. I could have gotten over the fact that aliens exist in Sonic, but the biggest problem I have with Black Doom and Shadow 05 as a whole is that it completely revamps Shadow's backstory for the worse. In Sonic Adventure 2, it's explicitly stated that Shadow was created by Gerald Robotnik. I didn't go into this before, but one of the most incredible things done in SA2 is that it's left up to interpretation whether or not Shadow's memories are real, and it's never even confirmed if he had met Maria. Many times in the game, Shadow's memory is put to question by characters like Rouge.
Do you actually believe that you're the real Shadow?
No doubt.
Even your memories might not be real, you know?
Even if my memories are not real, it's still me, Shadow.
As you can see, even Shadow buys into the idea that his memories could very well be fabricated, but he doesn't care because all he wants to do is fulfill his promise to Maria, someone that he thinks he's met. This idea is then corroborated later, in a scene in which the entire cast is shown the contents of Gerald's diary. It's here that Gerald recounts his life up until the point that he went insane. He's talking about creating the ultimate life form, about the military storming the Ark, and of what they inevitably did to his precious Maria. He only mentions Shadow after all these events have taken place, implying that the ultimate life form that he spoke of was the Bio-Lizard and not Shadow.
The colony was completely shut down, probably to keep your prototype from falling into the wrong hands.
All I could think about was to avenge her. Somehow, some way. I got scared as I no longer was able to control my thoughts. All I could think about was that I wanted it all to end. Based on my original projections, I was able to complete my project, Shadow.
Professor Gerald only created Shadow out of spite for what Gunn did to Maria, after she had already been killed. Being the acclaimed scientist that he was, Gerald was somehow able to either purposely alter or completely create many of Shadow's memories. I genuinely think that in SA2 and SA2 only, it was implied that Shadow never met Maria, and that Gerald had imprinted his hatred for humanity onto him by leading him to believe that they had all once lived happily on the Ark. Shadow would have been the culmination of all of Gerald's research, and Gerald would have only found the secret to immortality and the cure to Maria's crippling disease after she was already gone. After Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic Team could have taken two separate paths. They could have had Shadow's backstory continue in ambiguity, or do what they did in Shadow 05 and confirm the fact that Shadow's memories were real. And Sonic Team, of course, decided to go with the latter. I don't fault them for this, however, considering that Shadow was originally meant to die in SA2, and in order for him to be a major player in future Sonic titles, they would need a clear, cemented backstory for them to build off. What I don't like about this decision, though, was that Shadow 05 decided to retroactively change Shadow's backstory by implying that Gerald was only only able to complete Shadow by making a pact with Black Doom. This means that Shadow has Black Doom's DNA inside him, and that's what's pushing him to do evil acts rather than his own doubts or insecurities. I think Shadow having Black Doom's DNA undermines what he and Gerald went through during SA2, and I'd find it infinitely more tragic that if what helped Gerald complete Project Shadow wasn't making a random deal with the devil, but rather the death of his granddaughter causing him to go clinically insane. Shadow 05 also does other disrespectful things to Shadow. I don't mind him saying curse words or being forced to use vehicles. I can get down with that. I actually love the aesthetic of the game, but cutscenes like these,
This is like taking candy from a baby, which is fine by me.
just make me groan and think about how much Shadow has already fallen as a character after only 5 years of existence. Sonic Heroes had a great depiction of Shadow, so I don't see why it wouldn't be possible for them to get him right again. While Shadow 05 may have damaged Shadow's perception across gaming,
Do you like Sonic the Hedgehog games?
But do you think you would prefer them if they actually did not have Sonic the Hedgehog in them?
Well, you're in luck. We've got a Hedgehog game with absolutely none of the stuff that makes the Sonic games cool.
it only amplified his popularity and set the stage for the character going forward. So let's move on and see how Shadow is depicted when he's no longer the main character and isn't tied down to being forced to think about Maria. It's generally agreed that Shadow 05 brought in the dark age of the Sonic franchise. Claiming that Sonic had a rough transition to 3D is revisionist history, considering that both Sonic Adventures and Sonic Heroes all performed well critically. It was Shadow 05's middling reception that introduced the idea that Sonic was somehow a fundamentally flawed character within 3D spaces, and it was Sonic 06 that cemented the idea that the Sonic series was never good. But how does Sonic 06 handle its characters and thus its depiction of Shadow? Despite the name Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 06 is not a hard reboot of the franchise. I wouldn't even call it a soft reboot, as it clearly maintains and continues the already established continuity, and certain relationships, like that of Team Dark, are clearly informed by somewhat recent events. Shadow's story in 06 has nothing to do with Maria or the Black Arms. Maria is never mentioned by name, but through Shadow's actions and dialogue, you can tell her death informs all the decisions he makes and how he treats the characters around him. I feel as though this is the perfect direction to take Shadow. I find it much more engrossing for external factors, such as a new character like Mephiles trying to seduce Shadow to the quote-unquote dark side is so much more gripping than an intrinsic factor of something arbitrary like him having Black Doom's DNA inside him. Shadow's story throughout 06 is his most thought-provoking ordeal since SA2 and is one of the best depictions of the character. Shadow is again cunning, goal-driven, and serious, yet he can still read the room and entertain characters like Sonic. He doesn't neglect those in need and goes out of his way to save people when they're in trouble, such as when he chooses to catch Rouge instead of catching the Scepter of Darkness, unleashing an unknown evil into the world. This care for those around him is also shown in interactions with Omega, whom after seeing him broken down in the future after being taken there by Mephiles, Shadow tries his best to repair him to no avail.
It's not like we can do anything for him now.
Yeah.
The best part of Shadow's story throughout 06 though is his relationship with Mephiles. Shadow may not have been responsible for the creation of Mephiles, but he is responsible for sealing him inside the Scepter of Darkness for eternity. Throughout most of 06, Shadow doesn't even know what Mephiles is trying to accomplish, but after everyone is able to escape the future and travel back to the past, Shadow stays in order to confront Mephiles and learn the truth, and the two have a very telling conversation. Shadow asks Mephiles if he was responsible for destroying the world. Mephiles then, like he did with Silver, shows Shadow a supposed image from the future. It's him locked up in a capsule. Without even mentioning Maria, Mephiles is able to evoke some of the darkest images in Shadow's head. Shadow was locked up inside of a capsule for 50 years, and even after he had been woken up by Dr. Eggman, he was still a slave to the beliefs and hatred that Gerald Robotnik imprinted onto him. He's very rarely been able to act upon his own free will, and the first time he did so, it resulted in his death. Of course, Shadow miraculously survived, but to what cost? Only to be locked up again in a pod for however many years, waiting to be woken up to be forced to go through the same trauma that he'd been subjected to in SA2? I think this is an incredibly compelling direction to go on with Shadow, and it becomes even more tragic when Shadow learns that Omega will be the one that defeats him in the future and seals him away.
This only proves you were created to stop Shadow. Don't tell me you didn't know. You may have been programmed by humanity, but what you did to Shadow in the future, that was your...
This, of course, troubles Shadow knowing all that they've been through. He doesn't say much during the scene that this is revealed, as Rouge speaks for him, talking about how despite how good of a heart Shadow has, it's so unfair that all humanity will ever see him as is a weapon. As Shadow ruminates over this fact and begins to walk away, Rouge says this to him.
Shadow? Even if you believe everyone in the world will be against you, know that I'll always remain by your side. Remember that.
Determined, he continues to leave as the music swells and Team Dark is cemented as a team forever.
I will.
It's at this point a lull began in the Sonic franchise. From the years 2007 to 2016, Shadow the Hedgehog completely disappeared from starring in mainline Sonic titles. Shadow, the second most popular Sonic character, turned into the equivalent of Mighty the Armadillo. But how did this become the case? With Shadow 05, the public perception of Sonic began to change. There was now a notion that the series had lost its identity and had long since jumped the shark. And with the disaster that was Sonic 06, Sega learned all of the wrong lessons. Instead of determining that Sonic 06 was a failure because it was rushed, Sega concluded that 06 was flawed on a fundamental level and that it was their creative decisions that turned it into the flop that it became. Let's look at Sonic Unleashed for example. Shadow is mentioned nowhere throughout the plot of Unleashed. Its cast of characters is much smaller, compared to Sonic 06 or Sonic Heroes that juggled over 12 characters in their cast. It also features a clear shift in tone to the one established in SA2, preferring to have its story act a lot more akin to something like Heroes, albeit with much higher stakes. Story-wise, it makes sense for Shadow to be here, but thematically, and due to a plethora of outside factors and likely mandates from higher ups for the Sonic franchise to be rejuvenated, this change in tone and thinning of the roster would become commonplace from now on, and this would be the beginning of how Sega forgot about Shadow the Hedgehog. Sonic Colors marked yet another shift in the franchise. Sonic stories were always initially conceptualized and written in Japan. They would then go through localization like any other game would, but with Sonic Colors, Sonic Stories' English scripts from that point on would be in the hands of Ken Pontac and Warren Graff. It would be an understatement to say that these writers did not understand Sonic stories, but I try not to fault them as they were simply just doing their jobs, and it's been revealed after the fact that Sega told them explicitly not to incorporate the Sonic series' previous lore. Despite whoever's to blame for these changes though, the Sonic cast continued to become smaller, with not even Amy making an appearance this time around, and no new characters introduced that had any speaking roles. I'm honestly content that Shadow wasn't in Colors because of the blatant character assassination and mischaracterization that even Sonic was subjected to in this game. Colors and the eventual generations may have done well critically, but I feel like the soul of the Sonic franchise was dwindling at this point, and the faith I had in characters like Shadow or Knuckles being important again diminished further and further. At this point, a sense of apathy began to infect the Sonic franchise. Fans no longer cared because they felt like Sega didn't care. Sonic games output began to greatly diminish from the yearly releases of the 2000s to games taking 3 to 4 years to come out. And even despite of those long development cycles, Lost World, Sonic Boom, and especially Forces couldn't deliver and only damaged the Sonic brand even further. The Sonic franchise was in a rut at this point. After years of it underperforming, Sega blamed not themselves, but the character of Sonic himself for his middling software sales, when in reality, it was their treatment and negligence of him that put the franchise into the state it was in the first place. Sega had long since forgotten about Shadow, and now they were losing faith in Sonic. But then, a miracle happened. On February 14th, 2020, Sonic the Hedgehog released in theaters, and with it would come a surge of popularity that the Sonic franchise hadn't seen since 2004. After years of being in development hell, bouncing between studios, and undergoing a redesign so drastic that people think Paramount did it as a publicity stunt, Sonic crushed all expectations, and is perceived today as to what ushered in a new era of game-to-film adaptations. But what does this all have to do with Shadow? Shadow would make his debut at the end of Sonic Movie 2, and play a prominent role in Sonic Movie 3. And I think Paramount is in large part to thank for Sonic Team and thus Sega for remembering the value of the character and for him to play such a large role in the next step for the Sonic franchise. Shadow the Hedgehog had been forgotten about for so long, and all it took was a couple of films and dollar signs for Shadow to be brought back in full and made to star in his own game again. While it isn't the most traditional release, it still shows a sharp shift in Sonic Team's attitude towards Shadow and as well as the rest of the Sonic cast. But enough dancing around the subject. What do I think of Shadow Generations, and more specifically, what do I think about its depiction of Shadow? After missing Sonic's birthday to track a biosignature detected on the remnants of the space colony Ark, Shadow sees a Doom's Eye, and as he chases after it, is thrown into white space by the Time Meter. Deemed a temporal anomaly by Black Doom, I perceive white space to be a sort of purgatory where things exist out of time. This is the reason why Shadow is seeing what he thinks are visions of his past of both Maria and Gerald. The first scene in which they all interact is excellent. Shadow sees a little girl in the distance being attacked by the Black Arms, and being the hero that he is, does everything in his power to save her. After defeating them, he then realizes that this little girl is Maria, and knowing that this has to be some kind of dream, Shadow doesn't heed her embrace and only looks at her with complete bewilderment. In stark contrast though, when Shadow sees Gerald approaching him, Shadow looks at him in complete fear. I may not like Black Doom all that much, but I find his inclusion in Shadow Gens much more tolerable and enthralling due to the fact that he exists in a moment in time in which Maria is still alive. Black Doom doesn't do anything arbitrary like kidnap Maria or threaten to hurt her, but instead taunts Shadow, tells telling him to embrace his inner Black Doom DNA that's manifesting within him as newfound abilities. Shadow even has many lines in the game referring to how using these abilities feels natural for him. He of course would never give in to Black Doom's demands of joining him, but what I like about Shadow Gens is the position this puts Shadow in terms of his relationship with Maria. Maria knows firsthand why Shadow was created and what he is capable of. In spite of that though, Maria is never fearful of Shadow, even in moments when it's clear that Black Doom's DNA is coursing through his veins. There is a moment later in the game in which Black Doom taunts Shadow about how this time he won't lose and how much he's learned from their past encounter, to which Shadow shows an almost blind rage at the thought of losing to him. Knowing that this isn't really who Shadow is, Maria grabs his hands and tries to calm him down. Later on, this moment comes full circle, in which Shadow has finally embraced Black Doom's DNA. Maria thinks that Shadow is becoming what he sought to destroy, but the moment that she does, he says that he's let go of his blind anger and now fights for good, and it makes for the most memorable scene in the game.
But I will continue to fight. Fight with your wish in my heart. Your wish for everyone to have a chance to be happy.
This is the Shadow I knew growing up. The determined, goal-driven hero that could be playful, that could smile, and could even cry. This is how I want Shadow to be depicted from now on, as a multifaceted character that is oftentimes not tempted by the dark side, but forcibly pulled there by characters who weren't strong enough to take the path that he did. In spite of everything, of Shadow being turned into a joke through Shadow the Hedgehog, to Shadow having what is arguably his best depiction in a game that almost killed the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, Shadow's proven himself time and time again that he is indestructible, and no matter how much he's neglected by Sega, his legacy and the significance he has to the series will never be forgotten. If you want to determine the health of the Sonic series, I truly believe you can use how Shadow is being depicted as a litmus test. And considering how his story was handled throughout Shadow generations, and how it seems like Sonic Team is finally willing to embrace both the good and bad from the Sonic series past, I can honestly say that I'm optimistic for the future of Shadow and can't wait to see what else Sonic Team has in store. This has been Nolo as Fuck. Until next time.